The virgin mail-order bride trembled as she stepped off the dusty stagecoach, her future husband's stern silhouette casting a long shadow across the Montana territory. She carried nothing but a small valise and the weight of desperate choices that had brought her to this desolate ranch, a world away from everything familiar. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The winter of 1882 in the wilds of Montana was unlike any Mary Johnson had ever known. Snow piled in drifts taller than men, and temperatures plummeted so low that breath crystallized midair. The train that had carried her westward, her last hope for a new beginning, had deposited her at this desolate outpost before continuing its journey, leaving her alone with her dwindling courage. Mary sat on a splintered bench inside the Saddle Creek station, clutching her worn satchel to her chest like armor. The threadbare fabric of her traveling dress offered little protection against the bone-deep chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Her fingers, red and stiff, trembled as she smoothed a wrinkled letter, the correspondence that had promised her a husband, security, and perhaps, in time, even affection. "You ain't what was advertised," a gruff voice had informed her just minutes earlier. The man, her intended groom, had barely looked at her face before declaring her too plain and skinny to bear proper children, and stomping back into the blizzard. Mary had not cried then, but tears threatened now, burning behind her eyes as the station emptied of respectable travelers. Only the rough sorts remained. 3 bearded men huddled near the pot-bellied stove, passing a flask between them and casting sidelong glances in her direction. Their whispers carried across the drafty room. "Reckon she's fair game now," one murmured, his voice slurring at the edges. "No man to claim her." "Might do well at Widow Perkins' establishment," another suggested with a laugh that made Mary's stomach clench. The young woman hunched smaller, as if invisibility might be achieved through sheer will. Night was falling fast, and the station master had already announced his intention to lock up. Where would she go? The few coins in her purse wouldn't secure a room at the town's only boarding house. One of the men detached himself from the group, swaying slightly as he approached. The reek of cheap whiskey preceded him, mingling with unwashed clothes, and something predatory that made the hair on Mary's neck stand on end. "Looks like you need some assistance, miss," he drawled, standing too close. His shadow fell across her lap like a physical weight. Cold night for a pretty thing to be alone. Mary shrank back against the wall, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Her gaze darted toward the door, calculating the distance, wondering if her half-frozen limbs could carry her to safety. The man's hand reached toward her face and she flinched, wishing desperately for escape from this nightmare she'd willingly walked into. "Leave her be." The words cut through the station like a knife through butter, silencing the drunken murmurs instantly. Mary Johnson looked up to find a tall figure standing between her and the approaching threat. John Smith's broad shoulders blocked the leering man's path completely, his stance wide and unwavering. The rancher's face, weathered by years of Montana winters, revealed little emotion, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that made the troublemakers step back without another word. "I said, leave her be," John repeated, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable authority that seemed to fill the drafty station. The whiskey-scented man muttered something under his breath, but retreated to his corner, shooting dark glances their way. In the rancher's arms, a small child with rosy cheeks stirred, blinking sleepily at the commotion. The little girl couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old, bundled against the cold in layers of wool and flannel. Her curious eyes found Mary's, studying the stranger with innocent wonder rather than the judgment Mary had grown accustomed to. Without explanation or introduction, John shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it around Mary's trembling shoulders. The unexpected weight of it nearly buckled her knees, but the immediate warmth that enveloped her felt like salvation. The coat carried the scent of pine, horses, and wood smoke, smells of a life far removed from the one she'd fled. "Hold her a moment," he said gruffly, and before Mary could protest, he had transferred his daughter into her arms with surprising gentleness. The child settled against Mary's chest without hesitation, her small body warm and trusting. Sarah Smith, for that must be who this was, yawned widely and nestled her head against Mary's shoulder, as if they'd known each other forever. The simple, unearned trust of the child made Mary's throat tighten with emotion. "I'm getting the sled ready," John explained, his eyes briefly meeting Mary's before darting away. "Too cold to wait for whoever ain't coming." Mary stood frozen, uncertain what to say. Was he offering her shelter? The thought seemed impossible after weeks of rejection. The child in her arms shifted, one small hand clutching at Mary's collar. "Papa says it's too cold for anyone to be alone tonight," Sarah whispered, her breath warm against Mary's neck. Outside, the wind howled mercilessly, driving snow against the station windows. Inside, for the first time since stepping off that train into the Montana wilderness, Mary felt the faintest flicker of hope warming her chest, more comforting than even the borrowed coat around her shoulders. The warmth radiating from Sarah's small body surprised Mary more than the heavy coat draped across her shoulders. The child nestled against her chest, rosy-cheeked and trusting, despite having just met a stranger. Mary Johnson cradled the little girl awkwardly at first, her arms stiff with uncertainty. She had held few children in her life, and none who had looked at her with such immediate, unquestioning acceptance. "Are you cold?" Mary whispered, adjusting the woolen scarf around Sarah's neck. The child shook her head, burrowing closer. "Papa says I'm warm like summer, even in snow." Something flickered in Mary's chest, a sensation so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. Hope, tiny and fragile as a bird's heartbeat, but undeniably there, thawing the protective ice she'd built around her heart during the long journey west. John Smith moved with purpose, securing their few belongings to a wooden sled waiting outside the station. His movements were efficient, practiced, a man accustomed to harsh winters and self-reliance. Two horses stamped impatiently in their harnesses, their breath forming clouds in the frigid Montana air. "We need to move before the storm worsens," he said, his deep voice carrying despite its quietness. He extended his arms to take Sarah, but the child clung tighter to Mary. "She can stay," Mary found herself saying, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. The rancher nodded once, a barely perceptible movement, then helped Mary onto the sled, careful not to disturb his daughter. He tucked thick fur blankets around them both before taking his position at the front. As they set off into the gathering blizzard, silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken questions, but not unkind. The sled cut through deepening snow, following a path Mary couldn't see, but John seemed to know by instinct. Wind whipped around them, carrying ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. Mary found herself clinging to Sarah, drawing comfort from the child's steady breathing against her chest. The girl had fallen asleep, utterly trusting despite the howling storm. In that moment, with snowflakes catching in her eyelashes and a stranger's daughter warm in her arms, Mary felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving home, a sense of being needed. The vast Montana wilderness stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. Yet somehow, within this desolation, Mary felt anchored by the weight of the sleeping child and the broad shoulders of the silent man guiding them through the storm. "Not much farther," John called back, his words nearly lost to the wind. Mary nodded, though he couldn't see her, and held Sarah closer. Whatever waited at their destination, smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. As they approached, Mary Johnson clutched little Sarah closer, the child's weight both comforting and terrifying in its trust. "It's not much," John muttered, his voice almost lost in the howling wind as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The blast of heat from the wood stove hit Mary like an embrace, instantly chasing away the bitter chill that had settled deep in her bones during their journey. The cabin's interior was humble but meticulously organized, a testament to a man who'd learned to manage alone. Rough-hewn furniture, handmade quilts, and a few simple decorations carved from pine spoke of care rather than luxury. "You must be frozen through," the rancher said, moving to stoke the fire. The flames leapt higher, casting dancing shadows across the worn plank floors. Mary stood awkwardly in the center of the room, still holding Sarah, uncertain of her place in this strange man's home. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the sleeping child in her arms. "I'll show you where you can sleep," John said, noticing her discomfort. He led her down a short hallway to a small room off the kitchen. "It's the grain room, but I cleared it earlier. Been keeping it warm." The space was simple, a narrow cot with fresh linens, a small table with a lantern, and a chest for storage, but to Mary, who had expected to spend the night huddled in the train station or worse, it looked like sanctuary. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the magnitude of his kindness. John stepped forward. "Here, let me take her," he said, gently lifting Sarah from Mary's arms. The transition was seamless, the little girl barely stirring as her father cradled her against his broad chest. Mary watched as he carried his daughter to a small bed in the corner and tucked her beneath a pile of colorful quilts. His large, weathered hands moved with surprising tenderness, pulling the covers up to Sarah's chin and brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. When he straightened, his eyes met Mary's across the room. "Rest," he said simply, but his gaze lingered with quiet concern. "Morning comes early here." Left alone, Mary sank onto the edge of the cot, her fingers tracing the neat stitches of the quilt beneath her. Outside, the blizzard raged, but for the first time in months, she felt sheltered from more than just the cold. Mary Johnson lay awake in the darkness, listening to the gentle symphony of the cabin at night. The fire in the wood stove crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Nearby, Sarah's soft, rhythmic breathing provided a comforting counterpoint to the occasional groan of timber as the wind pushed against the cabin. For the first time since boarding that fateful train, Mary felt something close to safety wash over her. Not quite peace, her mind still raced with uncertainty, but the desperate terror that had been her constant companion had receded like a tide. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, savoring its weight and warmth. The grain room wasn't much, but compared to the exposed platform of Saddlequick's train station, it felt like a fortress against the Montana winter. Through the small window, she could see moonlight reflecting off endless snow, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. When dawn finally broke, Mary's empty stomach responded immediately to the rich aroma of bacon sizzling somewhere in the cabin. She rose quietly, smoothing her wrinkled dress as best she could before venturing toward the kitchen. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, announcing her presence. Sarah sat at the wooden table, her short legs swinging freely as she munched on a thick slice of toast slathered with preserves. The child's hair stuck out at odd angles, still mussed from sleep, but her eyes brightened when she spotted Mary. "Papa made breakfast," she announced, crumbs tumbling down her nightgown. John Smith himself stood by the door, dusting fresh snow from his heavy coat. His movements paused when he noticed Mary gathering the scattered pieces of laundry that had been drying near the stove. Small shirts and socks, belonging to his daughter, arranged haphazardly as if he'd hung them in haste. "You slept well?" he asked, his deep voice softened in the morning quiet. Mary nodded, not quite meeting his eyes as she carefully folded a tiny woolen sock. "Yes, thank you," she replied, her voice still carrying the hesitancy of someone unaccustomed to kindness. The rancher hung his coat on a peg by the door, revealing shoulders broad from years of... Without ceremony, he filled a plate and set it at the empty place at the table. "Eat," he said simply, the single word somehow both command and invitation. Sarah patted the bench beside her, leaving sticky fingerprints on the wood. "Sit by me," she requested, her innocent eagerness cutting through the awkwardness that hung between the adults. Mary settled beside the child, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the cabin's heat or the steaming plate before her. "You didn't have to," John Smith said gruffly as Mary folded the tiny shirts and socks, his calloused hands awkwardly hovering over the pile of laundry. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "I wanted to," Mary replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers worked methodically, smoothing each wrinkle from Sarah's small garments. She kept her eyes down, afraid to hope that kindness would be returned, afraid to see judgment in the rancher's weathered face. John cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "Been a while since things were tidy," he admitted, gesturing vaguely at the cabin. The walls held the lingering emptiness of a home that had known loss. Mary nodded, understanding more than she could say. The silence between them felt less strained now, like a frozen river beginning to thaw beneath the surface. "Sarah needs clean clothes," she offered simply. "She does at that." A hint of something like gratitude softened his expression before he turned away, reaching for his heavy coat. "Got wood to chop. Storm's coming tonight." The door closed behind him with a gentle thud, and Mary exhaled slowly. Through the window, she watched him stride toward the woodpile, his broad shoulders squared against the Montana cold. The axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, each swing precise and powerful. Inside, Mary filled the metal tub with water she'd heated on the wood stove. "Sarah," she called softly, "time for your bath." The little girl appeared in the doorway, clutching her worn teddy bear protectively to her chest. Her eyes, so like her father's, regarded Mary with cautious curiosity. "The water's nice and warm," Mary coaxed, kneeling beside the tub. "Would your bear like to watch from the chair?" Sarah's lips twitched, almost a smile. She approached slowly, placing her treasured companion carefully on the seat. "He doesn't like getting wet," she explained seriously. "Very sensible," Mary agreed, helping the child out of her nightgown. As warm water enveloped her small body, Sarah's initial shyness began to melt away. Mary gently washed her hair, humming a tune her own mother had once sung. The child splashed tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Suddenly, a giggle escaped Sarah's lips, bright and clear as a bell. The sound rang through the cabin, piercing months of silence. Mary found herself laughing too, her heart lightening with each shared moment. Outside, John paused mid-swing, the axe suspended in the air. Through the window, he caught sight of his daughter's face transformed by joy, and Mary's gentle hands guiding her. Something long dormant stirred in his chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its beginning. John Smith stood motionless at the frosted window, his breath creating small clouds on the glass. Outside, snow blanketed his ranch in pristine white, but his attention was fixed on the scene within. Through the partially open door, he watched Mary and his daughter, an unexpected tableau of domestic harmony that made something tighten in his chest. Mary's voice carried softly as she hummed a tune he didn't recognize, something light and airy that must have come from the city. Sarah sat in the wooden tub, splashing water with unrestrained delight, her giggles punctuating the melody. The young woman's hands moved gently as she washed his daughter's hair, her face transformed by a smile that reached her eyes. The rancher felt the hardness in his features soften. How long had it been since these walls had contained such simple joy? The cabin had been silent for too long, filled only with necessity and routine since his wife's passing. He'd forgotten what laughter sounded like echoing through these rooms. As evening settled over the Montana landscape, the three shared a simple meal of stew and bread. Sarah, exhausted from her bath and play, curled up on the braided rug before the fire, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful slumber. The wooden floorboards creaked as John added another log to the stove, the flames casting dancing shadows across the walls. In the hush that followed, Mary's voice emerged, barely above a whisper. "I never meant to impose on your kindness," she said, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her cup. "When I answered that advertisement, I thought maybe I could belong somewhere." Her eyes remained fixed on the sleeping child. "But I was just a mistake to him." The bitterness in her final words hung in the air between them. John understood she was speaking of the man who had sent for her, then rejected her at the train station, leaving her alone and vulnerable in a strange town. He watched her carefully, noting how the firelight caught in her hair, how her shoulders curved inward as if to protect herself from further hurt. The young woman before him was nothing like the mail-order brides he'd seen come through Saddle Creek, women with calculating eyes or desperate smiles. There was something genuine in Mary Johnson that spoke to him, something that reminded him of the person he'd been before loss had hardened him. The rancher didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he poured more coffee into her cup, the simple gesture saying what he couldn't yet put into words. For now, at least, she had found somewhere to belong. John Smith set aside the piece of harness he'd been mending, the worn leather still clutched in his weathered hands. The cabin had grown quiet as the evening settled in, with only the occasional pop from the wood stove breaking the silence. Mary's confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. "Ain't nothing wrong with being scared," he told her, his voice low and steady, the Montana drawl softening his words. "Means you still care what happens." Mary looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since she'd begun speaking. The lamplight caught the moisture gathering at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't look away. In that moment, she saw not just a stern rancher, but a man still capable of listening, of caring, despite everything he'd lost. "How do you know?" she asked, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the quilt draped across her lap. John shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "Lost my wife when Sarah was barely walking," he admitted. "Thought the fear would kill me too. Waking up every morning, wondering how I'd keep breathing." Mary's breath caught. This was more than the taciturn rancher had shared since her arrival at the cabin. The revelation settled between them, like a bridge slowly forming over troubled waters. "Does it ever stop?" she whispered. His callous thumb ran along the stitching of the leather. "But it reminds you you're still here, still fighting." Outside, the wind howled across the Montana plains, rattling the cabin windows. Mary pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, but the chill she felt wasn't from the winter air. "I thought I was weak," she confessed. "Running from a marriage that wasn't even real yet." "Takes courage to walk away from something wrong," John replied, his eyes finding hers again. "More courage than staying where you don't belong." Something in his steady gaze made Mary straighten her shoulders slightly. The rancher wasn't offering empty platitudes or dismissing her fears. Instead, he was acknowledging them, making space for them in this small cabin they temporarily shared. "Thank you," she said simply. John nodded once, then returned to his mending, but something had shifted between them. In the quiet of the Saddle Creek night, with snow piling against the cabin walls and his daughter's soft breathing from the next room, Mary felt the first tentative roots of trust beginning to form. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin as Mary Johnson rolled up her sleeves, determined to prove her worth. She'd noticed how John's eyes lit up when he mentioned his late wife's cooking, particularly her hearty stew. With Sarah playing quietly by the window, Mary gathered root vegetables and the precious meat John had brought from town. "I can do this," she whispered, recalling her mother's instructions from years ago. The pot bubbled promisingly at first, but as she stirred, something went terribly wrong. The broth thickened too quickly, sticking to the bottom of the pot. Mary panicked, adjusting the wood stove's heat. But flames leapt higher. Within moments, acrid smoke billowed through the small kitchen, the meat transforming from pink to charred black. Sarah's coughing pierced the chaos just as the cabin door flew open. John Smith stood frozen in the doorway, his face darkening as he took in the scene. The rancher's voice cut through the smoke like a knife. "What in God's name have you done?" he demanded, rushing to pull the pot from the fire. "That was the last of our good meat until spring." Mary stepped backward, her shoulders curving inward. I wanted to help," she stammered, watching as he threw open windows despite the winter chill. "Help?" John's voice rose with each word. "We can't afford mistakes like this. There's no mercantile around the corner to replace what's wasted." His words struck deeper than he knew. Mary felt her throat tighten as Sarah watched wide-eyed from the corner. The little girl's presence made the humiliation complete. "I'm sorry," Mary whispered, but the rancher had already turned away, scraping the ruined food into a bucket for the pigs. Unable to bear the weight of her failure, Mary fled through the back door, her boots crunching through snow as she made her way to the barn. Inside, the familiar scent of hay and horses enveloped her as she collapsed onto a soft pile near the back wall. Tears came hot and fast, soaking into her palms as she pressed them against her face. "Stupid, stupid," she murmured, the voice in her head growing louder with each sob. It was the same voice that had followed her from Boston, from the failed engagement, from every disappointment. "You don't belong here," it whispered. "You don't belong anywhere." The barn's shadows lengthened as Mary curled tighter into herself. Outside, the Montana winter continued its relentless assault on the small ranch. Indifferent to the woman who felt as fragile and out of place as a wildflower in snow, Mary sat in the barn for what felt like hours, the smell of hay and horses her only company as night crept over the Montana landscape. The winter chill seeped through the wooden walls, but she barely noticed, too consumed by the sting of her cooking failure and John's harsh words. Her hands still smelled of burnt meat, a reminder of her inadequacy. A soft knock on the barn door startled her. Mary quickly wiped her tear-stained face as the door creaked open, revealing little Sarah Smith standing there in her white cotton nightgown, her small feet bare despite the freezing ground. The child clutched something in her tiny hand. "You shouldn't be out here without shoes," Mary said gently, concern momentarily overshadowing her own misery. "Your feet will freeze!" Sarah padded across the hay-strewn floor, seemingly unbothered by the cold. When she reached Mary, she extended her hand, offering a slightly crumbled cookie. "I saved it from yesterday," the little girl explained, her voice small but determined. "Papa said I couldn't come find you, but I waited till he was chopping wood." Mary accepted the simple gift, her throat tight with emotion. The cookie was clearly one she'd helped Sarah bake 2 days prior, misshapen, but made with such earnestness. "Papa yells a lot," Sarah continued matter-of-factly, settling beside Mary on the hay. "But he likes when someone stays." She looked up with those wide, innocent eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. "Nobody stays with us very long." The child's words struck Mary with unexpected force. Behind John's gruff exterior and harsh reaction was perhaps not anger but fear. Fear that she too would leave, like others before her. "Are you going away?" Sarah asked, her small fingers finding Mary's hand. Before Mary could answer, Sarah wrapped her arms around her in a fierce hug, burying her face against Mary's shoulder. The simple, unconditional affection broke something inside Mary, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, not of shame this time, but of something warmer and more hopeful. "Let's get you back inside before your father worries," Mary whispered, rising and lifting Sarah into her arms. Later, after tucking the child into bed, Mary returned to her small room. The cabin was quiet now. John had retreated to his bedroom without a word, though she noticed he'd cleaned the kitchen completely, erasing all evidence of her cooking disaster. That night, wrapped in quilts, and the echo of unexpected kindness from the smallest resident of the Smith, the first light of dawn crept through the small window, casting a pale glow across the grain room. Mary Johnson stirred beneath the quilts, her body still aching from yesterday's work, hauling water and helping with the livestock. As she reached for her shawl, her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar on the edge of the bed. It was her blue cotton dress, the one she'd arrived in, now bearing a neat row of stitches where the hem had been torn during her journey from back east. The mending was clearly done by inexperienced hands. The thread wavered slightly, pulling too tight in some places and leaving gaps in others. Yet there was something profoundly touching about those imperfect stitches. They spoke of care, of attention paid when she thought no one was looking. Mary ran her fingertips over the repair, her throat tightening. She knew immediately who had done this. The rancher wasn't one for many words, but his actions revealed what his gruff exterior concealed. John had noticed the torn fabric when she'd hung it to air out yesterday. He must have worked on it after she and Sarah had gone to sleep. Standing in the doorway between the grain room and the main cabin, Mary clutched the mended dress against her chest. Through the frost-edged window, she watched as the morning sun transformed the Montana landscape. The snow glistened, beginning its slow surrender to the strengthening February light. A pair of chickadees flitted between bare branches, their movements quick and purposeful against the vast whiteness. "Does it suit?" John's voice came from behind her, quiet but resonant in the morning stillness. Mary turned, meeting his eyes briefly, before looking down at the dress. "I didn't expect. You didn't have to do this." "Wasn't much," he replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His calloused hands, capable of breaking wild horses and chopping firewood for hours, looked suddenly uncertain at his sides. "It means something to me," Mary whispered. "Thank you." Sarah bounded into the room then, her nightgown rumpled and hair wild from sleep. "Papa fixed your pretty dress," she announced proudly. He pricked his finger 3 times. A rare smile crossed John's face as he ruffled his daughter's hair. "Some things are worth a little trouble," he said, his gaze lingering on Mary for a moment before he turned away to stoke the fire. Mary watched him go, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. For the first time since stepping off that train into the bitter Montana winter, she felt truly seen, not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as someone worth noticing, worth mending. Rumors in Saddle Creek traveled as fast as the winter wind across the Montana plains. By the second week of Mary Johnson's stay at the Smith Ranch, whispers had transformed into full-blown gossip. The story of the runaway bride, hiding with the widowed rancher, spread from porch to porch, embellished with each telling. Mary first noticed it during a trip to the mercantile. She needed thread to mend Sarah's torn dress, a small task that gave her purpose. As she reached for a spool, conversation died like a snuffed candle. 3 women huddled near the counter, their eyes following her movements with undisguised judgment. "Good morning," Mary offered, her voice barely audible above the creaking floorboards. Mrs. Peterson, the shopkeeper's wife, merely nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. When Mary approached to pay, the woman placed her coins on the counter rather than touching her hand. "Come along, Betsy," one mother whispered loudly, pulling her daughter away as the child smiled at Mary. "We don't associate with women of questionable character." The words stung worse than the bitter cold outside. Mary clutched her purchase and hurried back to the wagon where John waited, his face darkening as he noticed her reddened eyes. "What happened?" he asked, his voice gruff with concern. "Nothing," Mary lied, unable to burden him with more troubles. Sunday brought fresh humiliation. Mary had carefully pressed her best dress, faded but clean, and helped Sarah into her church clothes. They arrived at the white clapboard building as bells chimed across the valley. John nodded at familiar faces, but the usual greetings were replaced with stiff acknowledgments. Inside, an entire pew emptied when they approached. Sarah, innocent to the slight, simply climbed onto the bench and swung her legs. Mary felt the weight of dozens of stares burning into her back throughout the sermon about sin and redemption. After service, Reverend Williams spoke of charity while his wife whispered behind her hymnal. When Mary reached for a cookie at the fellowship table, Mrs. Williams quickly moved the plate away. "These are for regular members," she said sweetly, poison beneath her smile. That evening, Mary removed her church dress with trembling fingers. Each sideways glance and whispered comment had chipped away at her fragile sense of belonging. The following Sunday, she claimed illness when Sarah asked about attending service. "You and your pa go on," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "I'll have dinner waiting." Alone in the cabin, Mary pressed her forehead against the frosted window, watching them disappear down the snowy path. Her reflection stared back, a woman caught between worlds, belonging to neither. The hope that had begun to bloom in her heart withered a little more with each passing day. Mary Johnson had been trying to ignore the whispers for weeks. The sideways glances at church, the hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. She'd endured them all with quiet dignity. But today, at the Saddle Creek feed store, the final blow fell like an axe. She'd been waiting by the counter while John Smith purchased supplies when Hank Miller, an old friend from his cattle driving days, sauntered over. The weathered rancher clapped John on the shoulder, his voice carrying through the store. "Taking in strays now, are ya? Heard she can't even cook without burning the place down," Hank chuckled, eyeing Mary as if she weren't standing right there. "Mighty generous of you to shoulder such a burden." John's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Mary slipped outside, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The walk home was a blur through tears she refused to shed in public. That evening, after Sarah had fallen asleep, Mary sat on her cot in the grain room, the child's steady breathing a painful reminder of what she'd begun to hope for, and what she could never truly have. The townspeople were right. She was nothing but a burden, an unwanted outsider who didn't belong. With trembling hands, she folded her spare dress and nightgown, tucking them into her worn satchel, alongside the small wooden comb John had given her last week. She waited until the cabin fell silent, then crept through the darkened kitchen, pausing only to place a hastily written note on the table. The night air hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside. Snow had begun falling again, thick flakes swirling in the moonlight. Mary clutched her thin coat around her shoulders and started down the path toward town, each step sinking into fresh powder. She'd made it perhaps half a mile when she heard the crunch of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw John approaching, his broad figure unmistakable even in the darkness. He wasn't running, but his long strides ate up the distance between them with determined purpose. "Where are you going?" he demanded when he reached her, his breath creating clouds in the freezing air. His voice was gruff, but something in his eyes betrayed concern rather than anger. Mary clutched her satchel tighter, the cold biting at her exposed skin as snowflakes caught in her eyelashes. She'd thought slipping away would be easier than saying goodbye. Now, facing him in the silent, snow-covered night, she realized how wrong she'd been. "All I see is people laughing, whispering like I'm nothing," Mary Johnson said, her voice breaking as she clutched her worn satchel tighter. The Montana winter wind whipped around them, carrying snowflakes that caught in her eyelashes and melted with her tears. John Smith stepped closer, his broad shoulders blocking the worst of the wind. His eyes, usually guarded, burned with an intensity that startled her. "You're someone this place didn't know it needed," he insisted, his breath forming clouds between them in the frigid night air. Mary shook her head, remembering the cruel whispers at the mercantile, the sideways glances at church. "Your friend at the feed store made it clear what everyone thinks of me. I'm just a burden to you and Sarah." The rancher's expression softened slightly, though his jaw remained set. "Folks round here fear what they don't understand," he said, his voice low but firm. "They don't know you like—" He stopped himself, looking away briefly before continuing. "Like we do." Mary felt her resolve wavering. The thought of Sarah's small face, peaceful in sleep back at the cabin, made her heart ache. But the shame of being the town scandal burned just as fiercely. "I can't stay where I'm not wanted," she whispered, her words nearly lost in the howling wind. John reached out slowly, as if approaching a skittish colt, and took her bag, not yanking it away, but offering a choice. His calloused fingers brushed against hers, warm despite the cold. "You're not leaving tonight," he said. Not a command, but a plea wrapped in gruff concern. "Not in this weather, not like this." Mary looked past him toward the distant lights of Saddle Creek, then back to the dark path leading to the Smith Ranch. The snow had deepened since she'd fled, making the journey back nearly as treacherous as continuing forward. "Just till morning," she conceded, though they both recognized the lie in her words. John nodded once, relief briefly softening the hard lines of his face. He didn't offer his arm or try to guide her. Instead, he walked beside her, matching his stride to hers as they trudged through knee-deep snow. The silence between them felt different now, less like the wary distance of strangers and more like the quiet understanding of two people who'd seen each other's vulnerabilities and chosen not to exploit them. As the cabin came into view, a single lantern still burning in the window, Mary felt something shift inside her chest. Not belonging, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. "Thank you," she said simply, her words barely audible. The rancher glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "For what?" "For coming after me." The morning sun filtered through the barn's weathered slats, casting striped shadows across the straw-covered floor. John Smith had risen early to repair the broken stall door before the day's work began. The wild Mustang, a recent addition to the ranch, paced nervously in the confined space, its dark eyes watching John's every movement with suspicion. Mary Johnson was hanging laundry when she heard the crash followed by a strangled cry. She dropped the damp shirt and ran toward the barn, her heart pounding against her ribs. Inside, she found John sprawled in the straw, clutching his leg as blood seeped between his fingers. "Don't move," she commanded, surprising herself with her steadiness. The Mustang snorted and stamped in the corner, still agitated from the encounter. Mary grabbed a clean cloth from the workbench and knelt beside the rancher. His face was pale beneath his weathered tan, jaw clenched against the pain. "Let me see," she said softly, gently pulling his hands away. The gash was deep, running along his calf where the horse's hoof had caught him. Without hesitation, she tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound. "Water bucket," John grunted, nodding toward the corner. Mary worked quickly, cleaning the wound with water and the small flask of whiskey John kept for emergencies. Her hands trembled slightly, but her movements were precise. She had tended injuries before, back home, before everything fell apart, but never had she been this close to him. Never had she touched him with such intimate care. John watched her face as she worked, noticing the slight furrow between her brows, the way she bit her lower lip in concentration. When she began wrapping his leg with strips of clean cloth, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. "You've done this before," he observed, his voice rough with pain. Mary nodded. "My father was often injured in his work. I learned young." As she secured the bandage, her fingers brushed against his skin, and she felt him tense. For a moment, fear flickered across her face, the instinctive reaction of someone who expected harshness to follow tenderness. John saw it and recognized it for what it was. He reached out slowly, his calloused hand covering hers. "I ain't going to hurt you, Mary," he whispered, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond the physical. Mary's eyes filled with tears, one slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. "No one's ever said that before," she replied, her voice barely audible. The moment stretched between them, fragile and profound. Outside, the Montana wind whistled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called. But in the quiet of the barn, something fundamental had shifted. A promise made, a trust beginning to take root. Sarah emerged from the hallway with quiet footsteps, her small figure silhouetted against the dim light of the cabin. In her arms, she clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted in places, one button eye hanging by threads, a testament to years of love and comfort. The little girl approached Mary Johnson with the careful deliberation that only children can summon when performing what they consider a momentous act. Mary looked up from where she sat beside John, her fingers still damp from the water basin where she'd cleaned his wound. The intimacy of the moment, her hands on his skin, his vulnerability before her, had created something fragile between them, something neither was ready to name. "This is Penny," Sarah whispered, holding out the stuffed companion that had clearly been her nighttime guardian through many Montana winters. The child's eyes, so like her father's, held a wisdom beyond her years. "She cries when she's scared," Sarah explained with perfect seriousness. "You can hold her now." The rancher watched silently from his chair, his usually stern expression softening as he observed the exchange. His daughter, who had lost so much already in her young life, was offering her most precious possession to the woman who had arrived like a winter storm, unexpected and transformative. Mary's hands trembled as she accepted the bear, feeling the worn fabric beneath her fingertips. The simple gesture pierced through her defenses more effectively than any grand declaration could have. This wasn't mere kindness, it was invitation, permission to belong. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching. "I'll take good care of her." Sarah nodded solemnly, then climbed onto Mary's lap without hesitation, settling against her as naturally as if they'd spent a lifetime together. The weight of the child felt right. Like an anchor in the storm, Mary had been weathering since stepping off that train at Saddle Creek Station. John cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the pair. "Sarah doesn't share Penny," he said quietly. "Not with anyone." The unspoken meaning hung in the air between them. In this rough-hewn cabin, far from the whispers and judgment of town, something was taking shape. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something new. Something chosen. Mary cradled both the child and the bear, feeling the steady rhythm of Sarah's breathing against her chest. Outside, the Montana wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside, the three of them existed in a pocket of warmth that felt, for the first time since Mary had arrived, like possibility, like home. The storm arrived with no warning, howling like a wounded beast as it battered the cabin walls. Rain turned to sleet, then to driving snow that pelted the windows with icy fingers. Mary Johnson had just finished washing the supper dishes when Sarah's first cough echoed through the small home. By midnight, the child's skin burned with fever. Mary cradled Sarah against her chest, the little girl's nightgown damp with sweat despite the bitter cold seeping through the cabin's walls. "She's burning up," Mary whispered, her voice tight with worry, as John pressed a weathered hand to his daughter's forehead. "I'll fetch more wood," he said, his face a mask of helplessness. The rancher disappeared into the howling night, returning minutes later with his arms full of split logs, snow melting in his dark hair. Mary worked tirelessly, layering quilt after quilt around Sarah's small frame, while John built the fire higher. The wood stove radiated heat, but Sarah's teeth chattered between ragged coughs that seemed to tear from her very soul. "I've seen this before," Mary said, dipping a cloth into cool water. "My neighbor's children back east." She trailed off, gently pressing the compress to Sarah's forehead. "We need to keep her warm, but bring the fever down." Throughout the endless night, John paced the floorboards, his heavy footsteps marking time like a pendulum. Every few minutes, he would stop beside them, his calloused fingers brushing Sarah's cheek or squeezing Mary's shoulder. Small gestures that spoke volumes in the quiet cabin. Mary never left her post. She sang lullabies from her childhood, songs her own mother had once sung, melodies about spring meadows and gentle streams that seemed impossibly distant in this Montana winter. Her voice, though tired, remained steady and soft. "You're doing fine," John murmured around 3 in the morning, when Sarah's breathing seemed especially labored. "Better than fine." Their eyes met briefly in the firelight, and Mary saw something there she hadn't before. Not just gratitude, but trust. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, Sarah's fever finally broke. The child stirred in Mary's arms, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze, then recognition dawned. "Mama stayed," Sarah whispered, her small hand reaching up to touch Mary's tear-stained cheek. Mary froze, a word echoing in her heart. She glanced up to find John watching them, his expression unreadable in the early morning light. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow, and a silence so complete it seemed to hold its breath, waiting. John Smith knelt beside the chair where Mary Johnson sat cradling Sarah, his calloused hand coming to rest gently on her shoulder. The weight of it, warm, steady, made Mary's breath catch. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "I heard her call you that," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, like gravel beneath a wagon wheel. "Mama, you didn't have to teach her." Mary's fingers trembled as they brushed Sarah's forehead, now cool to the touch. The fever had broken sometime before dawn. "I didn't," she admitted softly. "It just happened." The rancher's eyes, usually guarded behind years of solitude, held a vulnerability that made Mary's heart ache. He looked away, studying the grain of the floorboards. "Haven't heard that word in this house since—" His voice trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between them. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Mary said quickly, fear tightening her throat. She'd grown to love this child, this man, this life, but what right did she have to claim any of it? John shook his head, the morning light catching the silver strands at his temples. "That's not what I meant." His thumb traced a small circle on her shoulder, the gesture so tender it nearly undid her. "Sarah sees something in you I thought was lost to us forever." Outside, the Montana wind whistled through the eaves, a counterpoint to the silence within. Mary watched as John struggled to find words. This man of action, not sentiment. "When you came off that train," he finally continued, "you were running from something. So was I, in my way. Been running for 3 years since Elizabeth died." Mary's eyes filled at the mention of Sarah's mother, a name she'd heard only in whispers. "But watching you with her," John's voice broke. "You stayed, through the gossip, through the cold, through her fever when anyone else might have given up." In the chair beside them, Sarah stirred slightly, mumbling in her sleep before settling again. Mary adjusted the quilt around the child's shoulders, an instinctive gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "Trust doesn't come easy to me anymore," John admitted, finally meeting her gaze. "But I trust you, Mary. With her, with—" he swallowed hard, "with everything." In the hush of this new day, something fragile and miraculous took root between them. Trust, hard-won and quietly fierce, woven together by shared trials and whispered promises. Not love spoken aloud, not yet, but its foundation, solid as the earth beneath the cabin. Mary reached out, her fingers finding his, and for once, neither pulled away. Spring arrived in Montana like a hesitant visitor, melting the snow in patches and coaxing green shoots from the thawed earth. The transformation outside mirrored the one within Mary Johnson's heart as she stood at the fence line of the Smith Ranch, watching a herd of wild horses gallop across the awakening meadow. The wind tousled her hair as she leaned against the weathered wood, her fingers no longer bearing the rawness of city hands. Months of ranch work had strengthened her, leaving calluses where once there had been softness. She was no longer the trembling young woman who had stepped off the train in Saddle Creek with nothing but a worn satchel and fading dreams. From the cabin behind her came the sound of Sarah's laughter, bright and clear in the spring air. The little girl had blossomed with the warming days, her cough long gone, replaced by endless energy that kept both Mary and John on their toes. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" John Smith's voice came quietly as he approached, his footsteps familiar now after months of sharing the same space. Mary nodded, not turning away from the sight of the Mustangs. "Free," she whispered, "just like I thought I wanted to be." The rancher stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. The silence between them had evolved from awkward to comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. They had weathered the winter together, not just the Montana cold, but the frost of gossip, the chill of uncertainty. "I made something," John said finally, his voice gruff with emotion he still struggled to express. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object and placed it in her palm. Mary looked down to find a carved wooden horse, its lines simple but elegant. The craftsmanship revealed hours of careful work, each detail lovingly rendered. When she turned it over, she discovered initials etched beneath its belly. "M.J.S. "I made it after that night," he explained quietly, "when you stayed with Sarah through her fever." Mary's vision blurred as she traced the letters with her fingertip. "John, "You don't have to say anything," he interrupted, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Just wanted you to know that, well, you belong here, if you want to." A tear slipped down her cheek as she closed her fingers around the wooden horse. The token represented everything she'd found in this place: protection, purpose, and the possibility of love. Not the desperate kind she'd once chased, but something steadier, built on daily choices and quiet moments. "Thank you," Mary whispered, smiling through her tears as she clutched the carving close to her heart. The early morning sun cast golden light across the ranch as Sarah Smith bounded through the tall grass, her laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Mary Johnson watched from the porch, her heart swelling with a joy she'd never thought possible just months ago. The little girl who had once been a stranger now chased butterflies with the same trust and abandon with which she'd offered her teddy bear on that pivotal night. John approached quietly, his strong arms slipping around Mary's waist. The gesture, once unimaginable, now felt as natural as breathing. "She's happy," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude. "We all are," Mary replied, leaning into his embrace. In the months since that snowy night at the train station, Mary had transformed from a terrified young woman with nowhere to go into someone who belonged. The cabin that had once seemed merely a shelter from danger now felt like the center of her world. No longer did she flinch at shadows or fear being sent away. This was home. "I never dared hope for this," she whispered, watching as Sarah collected wildflowers in the meadow. "Not after everything." John's weathered hand found hers, fingers intertwining. There had been no formal proposal, no white dress or church ceremony, nothing like the marriage she'd once fled from. Instead, their bond had been forged in quiet moments, tending Sarah's fever together, mending clothes by lamplight, sharing stories of past hurts and healing. "You know what the folks in town are saying now?" John asked, a rare smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Mary shook her head, though the gossip from Saddle Creek no longer stung as it once had. "They're saying I got lucky," he continued, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "For our table," she announced proudly, pressing the wildflowers into Mary's hands. That evening, as twilight painted the Montana sky in shades of lavender and gold, the three of them sat around the hearth. The cabin, once silent and cold, now pulsed with life, with Sarah's bedtime stories, with John's quiet laughter, with the simple rhythm of family. Mary gazed at the carved wooden horse that now sat on the mantel, its presence a testament to change. The Smith family had become whole not through legal documents or social expectations, but through the daily courage to choose each other, through storms and sunshine, through doubt and certainty. Beneath the endless Montana sky, Mary had found what the frightened girl at the train station could never have imagined. Not just safety, but belonging. Not just shelter, but love.